Scramble, Super Cobra, Frogger. Games that gave Konami its recognition early on in video game history. In 1983, the developer extended its business to the booming home computer market. Hardware manufacturers around the world had launched their own unique systems to get their piece of the pie. However, software wasn't exchangeable between platforms. Konami saw potential in a new platform that strayed from these conventions, the MSX. It was designed to introduce a standard in the home computer market, allowing different companies to manufacture their own MSX computers while keeping the software compatibility. Konami's new PC division would fully dedicate their efforts to the MSX platform. Within a couple of years, they delivered no less than 30 games spanning all popular genres, sports titles, and ports of their latest arcade hits, but also compelling new game concepts. The pseudo-3D Antarctic Adventure, for instance, programmed by Akihiko Nagata, which earned him a supervisory role not long after. Konami rapidly earned a reputation among owners of the MSX platform. With their clever engineering, they were able to work around many of the hardware's visual limitations. For instance, the MSX was restricted to single-color sprites. A simple workaround was to stack multiple sprites to create colorful characters. To generate the illusion of a scrolling playfield, programmers had to code a routine that could constantly update the layout of the background layer during gameplay. Because the visuals that make up this layer are all placed in a static grid of 8x8 pixel blocks, levels could only scroll with 8-pixel increments. To achieve the effect of smooth scrolling demanded some more inventive solutions. In the cute shoot-'em-up game Pippols, the developers came up with the trick of using short, pre-made animation loops. These tiny sequences would all connect seamlessly to produce a scrolling playfield. Pippols was also a fine example of the team's creativity when it came to game concepts, not only breaking away from the space combat theme that dominated the genre, but also allowing players to find their own route through the game, leading them to haunted forests and a maze of moai statues. Pippols was able to produce a true sense of scope and adventure with just 16 kilobytes of cartridge space. The following year, they outdid themselves with Nightmare. It was a project led by Ryohei Shogaki, another key figure in the MSX team. He came up with the design for the brave knight Popolon, who would star in this Greek mythology-themed shoot-'em-up. Like Pippols, Nightmare was an early example of a game that immersed the player in an adventure setting. On the gameplay front, the Konami team loaded the game with mechanics, staple elements like weapons, a shield, and power-ups, but also more original concepts, like the magic blocks that can be both a blessing and menace to Popolon. A fun concept that was introduced in Nightmare was the pause animation sequence, to add a bit of humor to this challenging game. This quickly became a trend among the MSX Konami releases. Nightmare hit the market early in 1986 and became a highly acclaimed title, clearly setting itself apart from other games in the genre. It was an indication of the direction the MSX team was heading in. By 1986, Konami had already expanded into 3 separate divisions, each catering to a different segment of the market. Alongside arcade and PC, they had set up a console division to take advantage of the rapidly growing success of Nintendo. Their output initially revolved around porting arcade games, for example, the mega-hit Gradius. Their efforts inspired Akihiko Nagata to have the MSX team make a port themselves. Up until that point, the vast majority of shoot-'em-ups for the MSX platform were vertically oriented, the reason being that the MSX had a hardware restriction of displaying 4 sprite tiles per horizontal line, a serious bottleneck for horizontal-oriented games, and thus many thought successfully porting Gradius would be a bridge too far. But this didn't stop the team from programming a tech demo to find workarounds for the limitations. They even set themselves the lofty goal of implementing the screen-stretching lasers only featured in the arcade version. The solution the programmers came up with was to use the background layer to display a multitude of enemies and laser fire. Although they could only move across a grid of 8x8 pixel blocks for fast-moving objects like lasers, this was less of an issue. Deciding which objects to display on the background and which would be sprites required some careful planning, finding the best balance to hide each of their limitations and still make it feel seamless to the player. The game would be Konami's first MSX game to be stored on a 1 megabit cartridge, branded Mega-ROM. It was 4 times the memory reserved for Nightmare and even surpassed the cartridge space of the Nintendo port. To fill up the extra memory, the team added a completely new bone-themed level and secret bonus stages. A fun little Easter egg they also included was adding Twin B as an optional character. MSX owners who had both games in their collection could unlock this feature by inserting both cartridges in their machine. The dedication of Konami's MSX team to keep up with other divisions despite the limitations of the hardware led to some excellent ports that more than satisfied owners of the platform. Gradius became one of the best sellers for the MSX and encouraged them to develop 2 unique sequels. 1986 had been the heyday of the MSX platform in general. Although it was far from a worldwide standard, there were specific markets where it really thrived. Philips, for instance, had begun manufacturing MSX computers a couple of years prior, leading to a growing install base in their home country, the Netherlands. Over at Konami, all the development teams moved to a new office building in Kobe during the summer of 1986. Coinciding with this move, they also introduced their new corporate identity. At this point, the console team was starting to work on their own original titles, for instance Akumajo Dracula, or Castlevania as it later became known. Konami had a multi-platform strategy. Developers were encouraged to take promising or successful games from other divisions and create ports of their own. The MSX division would, in these circumstances, reinterpret the game plans in a way they thought best fit the platform and its audience. One of the division's trends was to fully embrace the adventure genre. So when it came to adapting Akumajo Dracula to the MSX, Nagato decided to infuse it with adventure gameplay elements. Each stage was designed as a small encapsulated open area. A hidden skeleton key opens the door to the next stage. There are countless items that can help the player increase their odds, although it's up for their consideration whether the side tour to obtain them is worth it. A central aspect, therefore, is for the player to find their own optimal route that fits their strategy, and take full advantage of power rings to get past tricky spots. The game was to be the first Konami release for the new MSX2 standard, a generation of MSX computers equipped with a more advanced graphics chip to match the capabilities of the consoles. Developers were no longer restricted to a fixed 16-color palette, but could pick from a 512-color master palette. The number of sprites per line was also doubled, although they were still restricted to a single color. Layering sprites on top of each other remained, therefore, a necessity. A new feature called the R-color granted one extra bonus color in these situations. The pixels of a character where 2 sprites would overlap could be assigned a different color, basically acting as a simplified blending mode. When it came to hardware support for scrolling, only vertical scroll was implemented in the MSX2. The Konami team therefore decided that relying on screen-by-screen gameplay would be the best choice. Their port, branded Vampire Killer in the West, managed to stand on its own with its distinct adventure flavor, and became a favorite among MSX owners. The licensed games King Kong 2 and Hinotori would also get a multi-platform treatment. The console and MSX divisions wrote their own game plans independently for both titles. The MSX team chose a top-down action-adventure gameplay style for their adaptation of King Kong 2. Hinotori was turned into a shoot-'em-up that could take full advantage of the vertical scrolling functionality of the MSX2. And it wouldn't be a true MSX Konami game if it wasn't loaded with its own distinctive game mechanics, like having to discover the path through each stage. The division had grown to approximately 30 employees, divided into smaller teams working on their own projects. The senior staff members had already garnered enough experience in their first 3 years and were ready to supervise the new talent. Among the new recruits was the planner Hideo Kojima, who joined in 1986. He didn't enter the company from a programming or art background, which contributed to his hardships initially, resulting in the cancellation of his first project. When he was asked to develop an action game in the vein of Capcom's Commando, he thought of ways to make it more suspenseful. Thinking back to his favorite movies and memories of playing hide and seek led him to a game plan that revolved around stealth and tension. With some encouragement from his supervisor, he got his concept greenlit and could officially start production on the inventive game Metal Gear. Kojima began with mapping out the levels, writing dialogue and overall backstory. His game stars the rookie of Special Forces Unit Foxhound, sent on a mission to infiltrate the armed fortress Outer Heaven. The theme facilitated the use of traps and obstacles for the player to avoid, straying from typical action-adventure conventions, paired with a unique way for the player to gain intel throughout the game via a transceiver. The suspenseful stealth gameplay can turn suddenly into a tense game of being hunted. Both game states are perfectly enhanced by the soundtrack. During his mission, Snake is challenged by top Outer Heaven specialists like Machine Gun Kid and Fire Trooper. These fights were vertically oriented to work around the horizontal sprite limit. With some guidance from Big Boss and members of the Resistance, the player slowly advances and unravels the true plot. Kojima's game plan and envisioned scope for the game were ambitious, to say the least. The limited cartridge space those days was perhaps the biggest challenge for the team. It ultimately resulted in them having to leave out all the prepared cutscenes and solely rely on text dialogue windows, a painful experience for the young, cinema-inspired game director Hideo Kojima. After some final graphical touch-ups, Kojima's inventive debut game was ready to hit store shelves. A frame from the movie The Terminator had been the perfect reference for the cover artist to portray the game's theme. Konami's Kobe office had their own in-house package design department that illustrated the artwork for boxes and promotional materials. In addition to using contemporary movies as reference, they also produced some stellar original artwork. Metal Gear was a standout release that quickly found its audience, ensuring Kojima would continue his career as a game developer. Although the MSX division had not been his first choice due to the hardware limitations, the creative spirit, tutoring, and overall freedom inside the team turned out to be exactly what he needed at this point in his career. Konami hadn't forgotten its loyal MSX1 fanbase over the past years, nor their star from Antarctic Adventure. The Penguin had taken some time off after his antics in his debut adventure. He attended the Ping Pong Championships and participated in a side project, the Game Master, a cheat cartridge that was actually based on the ones the developers themselves used for testing their games. The developers at Konami also continued to add secrets and cheats in their games that could be unlocked with the right cartridge combo. It was actually a fun system for MSX owners, leading them to experiment with combinations, share their findings, and borrow each other's games. The game Q*bert in particular was arguably used more as a cheat cartridge than an actual game, as it would unlock bonuses in several popular titles. A new hit for their unofficial mascot had also been in the making, Penguin Adventure, led by designer Ryohei Shogaki. The stakes are raised for the brave penguin as a seemingly incurable disease spreads across the kingdom. According to legends, the only cure is the fruit of the apple tree that grows on the Dream Continent, a faraway land where penguins once thrived before the ferocious Freezosaurus drove them away. The brave penguin Penta decides to make the dangerous journey to this lost continent and return with the healing fruit to cure the princess. Penguin Adventure was an iteration on the Konami hits Antarctic Adventure, Pippols, and Nightmare, building on their gameplay principles, while also loading the game with all kinds of gameplay elements to give it a true adventure flair. Fishermen offer Penta an array of helpful items, and whenever he's too short on the local currency, fish, he can try his luck at the slot machine. In hidden bonus stages, extra lives can be collected by navigating through an asteroid field in outer space. It's up to the player to discover all the secrets and keep track of the important events in the levels. Kojima was also asked to participate in the planning sessions when he had just joined Konami. A few of his proposed ideas and gimmicks would be incorporated into the final game, like the idea to enhance the boss battles. Penguin Adventure was a graphical marvel for the already aging MSX1 standard. Inside the game program, new assets or frames were constantly drawn on the background layer. The artist relied on Konami's sophisticated in-house developed graphics tools, drawing short animation loops of obstacles and environments with a 3D perspective, making the most of the fixed 16-color palette. By 1986, it had become standard practice to provide games with a full soundtrack. Konami's sound team delivered a range of catchy, upbeat melodies and dreamy tracks, making the whole experience even more immersive. Shogaki's extensive game plan had made Penguin Adventure an experience that would go far beyond a straight-up action game. Its success made Penta a true mascot for Konami's MSX team, and he would continue to pop up in their games. Shogaki's other hit game, Nightmare, was also ready for a sequel. His character, Popolon, would star in a grand side-view action-adventure, The Maze of Galious. Upon returning to Castle Greek, Popolon and Aphrodite learn that the High Priest Galious invaded the castle in their absence and has kidnapped their baby. The game spans a giant castle and 10 dungeons, each with their own puzzles and imposing guardians. Both characters are playable this time around, each having their own life bar and strengths and weaknesses. The Maze of Galious was one of the most ambitious MSX1 game plans in terms of scope. Luckily, by this point, projects were generally granted a longer development time. Instead of a couple of months, the Maze of Galious would take half a year of intensive labor. Developing for the MSX was relatively similar to developing for game consoles. The MSX team was equipped with the HP 64000 workstations, robust systems that were well suited to write software for an array of processors. These workstations were hooked up to an MSX and an in-circuit emulator to run and debug their code. However, there weren't enough workstations to equip each programmer, so teams were divided into day and night shifts. Working around the 4 sprites per horizontal line remained one of the bigger bottlenecks of the hardware. The team had to carefully position enemies across the screen, while continuing to display some interactive elements like rocks, items, and arrows on the background layer. As development came to a close, they unfortunately had to cut a planned 11th world because of the memory limitations. It wouldn't impact the overall experience, as the final game would still be packed with content and secrets. The Maze of Galious turned out to be another must-own Konami game that quickly amassed a big fan base. A variety of MSX magazines and guidebooks covered the game in great detail, helping the player on their way with hints and full maps. This was still a time in which these types of games would slowly unfold for the player over the span of months. Some of its secrets were actually so well hidden that they would keep fans occupied and speculating for years. Between '86 and '87, the Konami MSX division had produced an impeccable lineup of A-grade titles. Most of their game plans had incorporated a rich set of gameplay elements. For instance, the 2 exclusive Gradius sequels had greatly extended the scope of the original. Gradius 2 would also be the first game packed with an audio enhancement chip. Composer Masahiro Ikariko had suggested the concept of piggybacking the audio chip inside the game cartridges to push its audio capabilities. Konami continued their commitment to the MSX throughout the '80s. Like the other 2 divisions of the company, they operated independently and had their own struggles to deal with. They were considered to be developing for the least powerful hardware. In terms of sales, they could not compete with the console division that served the rapidly expanding Nintendo market. But this meant the MSX team experienced a great deal of independence and freedom to work on their own unique game plans, like the quirky Parodius. The action puzzle game King's Valley 2 was another title that greatly benefited the MSX platform. The ability to save data via data recorder or disk drive made it possible to add a level editor for players to create their own levels. This feature was linked to a design contest, with the winning entries being rewarded with a golden cartridge that featured their level. It was in this creative environment that Kojima got his next project approved. Inspired by graphic adventures for the PC-88, he began working on his own game in that genre, Snatcher. Striving for the same visual quality, he requested to develop his new project also for the PC-88. Management agreed under the condition that an MSX port would be developed alongside. Graphic adventures like Snatcher were narrative-based and puzzle-driven, which meant that in the lengthy planning phase, Kojima could fully concentrate on the story without being bogged down by technicalities. It would also be a welcome departure for new recruit Kinoshita. Rather than struggling to master the pixel art tools, he could rely on his skills with pencil and paper. To immerse himself in the work, he would listen to the soundtrack of Blade Runner. Kinoshita was personally also a big fan of the 70s TV show Bionic Woman and designed the character Jamie as a tribute to the show's protagonist Jamie Summer. He generated reference material the old-fashioned way by using a photo camera to capture specific frames while the show was being broadcast. Once the main cast and story beats were decided, he could start fleshing out the storyboards, drawing each scene in a way that fit the drama, concentrating on facial expression and composition. One point of consideration in particular was the drastic difference in size between Gillian and his little robot companion Metal Gear. Framing them in the same shot was therefore challenging. Once Kinoshita's outline drawings were approved, they were digitized and handed over to a team of pixel artists. Each image was cleaned up and colored to fit the desired feel and lighting. The level of personal involvement in the game manuals was another point that made the MSX team unique. Kojima loaded Snatcher's manual with extra backstory, illustrations, details, and even a little comic by Kinoshita. Kojima also considered having the game experience extend into the real world by adding a blood scent to the discs. It would spread around after the disc got heated from long usage inside the computer, and so simulate an ominous crime scene within the player's room. Luckily for the player, the concept was abandoned during production. Snatcher's development team hadn't been without its technical struggles. The cross-platform development had taken much longer than anticipated. It was designed with a small, specific audience in mind, and a planned third act of the game was therefore not considered viable to pursue after its release. Snatcher nonetheless became a cult classic and perfectly matched the older demographic of the home computers. Meanwhile, Konami's console division had ported the hits from the MSX team like Maze of Galious and Metal Gear. The latter became a commercial hit in the Western market. Kojima himself had not been involved in this port, nor did he have plans to work on a sequel. A conversation with a member of the console team while commuting back home ultimately changed his mind. It started Kojima thinking of a potential storyline. Not long after, he pitched his idea for Metal Gear 2: Solid Snake. While he was writing the game plan, all the designers were still assigned to other projects. Kojima decided to organize an in-house design contest for artists to participate in and design the look for Metal Gear D. It was Tomohiro Nishio's concept that got the stamp of approval. His realistic approach, designing it in a way that made sense from an engineering standpoint, perfectly lined up with the vision of the whole project. Once the team was fully assembled, they gathered all kinds of reference material until their desks were literally loaded with props, ranging from books and movies to gun models. They also participated in outdoor infrared gun games and even consulted a former Green Beret. It was clear that they'd set high goals to further deepen the stealth infiltration gameplay. The programmers started with implementing the main controls and Solid Snake's new abilities, like crawling. The AI of the soldiers was also greatly enhanced. They had a wider view of vision and the awareness to pick up on noises. Guards were also able to patrol multiple screens, making it necessary for players to use the new radar system to spot their movement. The ambitious game plan would once again demand a long development cycle, spanning the whole of 1989. Real-world events that happened during the development, like the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall, would force Kojima into doing several rewrites to prevent it from feeling outdated. The final storyline sets Solid Snake on a mission filled with intrigue and drama. Metal Gear 2 was shaping up to be a big visual improvement over its predecessor. The greatest advantage of the MSX2 hardware compared to the 8-bit consoles was its large master palette. The designers could therefore use a range of browns and greens for a sophisticated look. They also stretched the R color to its maximum potential, resulting in richly colored characters. One of the more outlandish game concepts was to have the majority of the game devoid of music. Instead, a heartbeat sound effect would consistently pulse to reflect the tension of a given scene. However, when this concept fell through, composer Masahiro Ikariko was suddenly tasked with providing a full score. Ikariko had been responsible for the bulk of the soundtrack for Snatcher previously, and would deliver over 30 tracks for the new Metal Gear. When Metal Gear 2 was just about to enter the final stage of production, designers and programmers inside the team were asked to assist with another game in production, SD Snatcher. This cutesy take on the original game had fallen behind schedule. The MSX division had a unique workflow in place that allowed all the game directors to evaluate each other's projects. It was not uncommon for a big chunk of the team to join in the final months to help or implement the new concepts that were brought up. For instance, the programming duo that delivered F1 Spirit were working on a game that leveraged all functions of the MSX2 and its upgrade, the MSX2 Plus, making it possible to implement smooth scrolling in both vertical and horizontal direction with even parallax effects. The game was certainly promising at this stage, but the MSX team felt it needed more to set it apart. It was the division supervisor, Nagata, who suddenly came up with the term Space Manbo. It was the spark for the new theme they added late in production, and so gave this Thundercross port its own identity. The fact that most of the Metal Gear 2 team was occupied getting SD Snatcher out the door actually worked out favorably. It gave the Metal Gear 2 project time to breathe, and the team an opportunity to reflect. The game had already been assigned a 3 megabit cartridge, but while the project was on hold, they further pushed it to 4 megabits thanks to dropping prices of memory chips. However, a rather more unfortunate trend was the dropping sales of MSX systems and software the past couple of years. The writing was on the wall, as Konami had already stopped officially releasing their games in Europe and would soon abandon the platform entirely. The MSX team knew it would be their final release for the MSX platform, making the whole experience bittersweet. After almost a year and a half of production, Metal Gear 2 finally hit retail in the summer of 1990. Like Space Manbo, it was praised by its audience and a true visual showpiece for the MSX. As the 80s had come to an end, the popularity of the home computer had diminished, losing its ground to game consoles and PCs almost entirely. But Metal Gear 2's legacy would ultimately stretch far beyond its initial release. It was this particular game that stayed in Kojima's mind when he began working on the next installment years later. Concepts like meeting a female spy in the lavatory, crawling through ventilation shafts, and heat-sensitive keys would provide a strong blueprint for the first 3D outing in the series. And so came an end to 7 years of Konami's strong ties to the MSX. Most of the crew split up to join the other divisions within the company. Their high-tier output and original game plans had kept MSX fans across the world captivated. Whether it was Nagata who pushed the technical limits, Shogaki and his adventurous game plans and fun characters, or Kojima and his love for cinematic games. However, these were just 3 of the many talented artists and programmers on this creative team. The limitations of the hardware and overall underdog spirit sparked the commitment and creativity within the team to bring compelling concepts, working around limitations and maximizing its strengths, making for a massive library of excellent games still to explore for many retro gaming enthusiasts.